Today's daf is daf Tzadi Aleph, and we're on the line that starts with Bas Kohen Minat Truma, which is 5 lines down from the top. So the Gemara interprets Afilu B'Truma D'Rabbanan, that if she's a Bas Kohen, she can no longer eat Truma because she had this relationship with the second, so to speak, husband, and she's disqualified even from Truma D'Rabbanan. As far as Truma D'Orais is concerned, that was Pshita. The Tana didn't have to teach that to them. The Mishnah says, Ein Yorshin Shalzeh v'Yorshin Shalzeh Yorshin Tsubasa. No one, whether it's the heirs of the first husband or the second, will inherit her ksuba. So the Gemara asks immediately, ksuba maya vidite. The Mishnah says that there is no ksuba. So how can you tell me that the Yorshim don't inherit the ksuba? There is no ksuba. What was the Havamina here that there could be a Yerusha on the ksuba? Amar Papa ksubas benin dichrin. The Rabbana made a special takana that if a woman in marriage dies before her husband, which means she cannot collect her ksuba, nevertheless, after she dies and then her husband subsequently dies, the banim that she has children, will inherit a special significant amount of money, which is the equivalent of the share of a ksuba, and that's in addition to their section, their part in the Yerusha. That's called ksubas banin benin dichrin. So let's say, for example, a man marries 2 women. So if he had married one woman, there would be no nafkamina here, because they're going to divide up the Yerusha, and that's going to be equally divided up. But if he has 2 wives, then one of the 2 wives, wants to guarantee that her children will be able to collect her ksuba. So this was a takana that was really not on behalf of her, and therefore it should not be subject to the knas that she deserves for getting married based on the testimony of one aid, but rather this was a takana that was instituted for the benefit of her children. So the Gemara says, Pshita mauda temal dida of the Isura Kansura Bana. She violated this Isur and she got married while her husband was still alive and relied on the testimony of one single witness. Kansura Bana, therefore they imposed a penalty on her. She loses her ksuba, but Lazara, as far as her children are concerned, lo kansu Rabbana, the Rabbana would not impose a knas that would force the banim zichron to lose their rights to collect the ksuba. The Mishnah says no, that the zchus of the banim is built into the ksuba, and this is also part of her ksuba, meaning part of her right in marriage in the framework of ksuba. So once the Rabbanan instituted this knas, it's going to impact on any aspect, any dimension of the ksuba, including ksubas banim dichrin. The Mishnah says, Achiv shel zeh v'achiv shel zeh choltzin v'lo miyabim. So Gemara says, I understand very well, Achiv shel rishon cholitz, certainly the brother of her husband, who's legally her husband, has to give her chalitza, the brother of the husband, and that's midoraisa. The lo miyabim rabbana, they concept her with a knas, a penalty that she cannot be misyabemis. But with regard to achiv shel sheni, I mean, that's not a valid marriage. Cholitz, the Torah would certainly not require chalitza, and the Gemara says mid'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan instituted another knas and another chumrah on her, slapped her with another requirement, namely that she can't get married based on just the get alone, but rather she needs chalitza as if she were married to the second husband, and with his death she fell for yibum. V'lo miyabim, lo b'deraisa, v'lo mirabbanan. As far as the din of lo miyabim, it means that on a derais level, for sure, there's no yibum because she was not married to this fellow. And even midrabanan, they're not going to allow her to be married to this guy because of the knas. Rabbi Yossi Omer, okay, so at this point it's Kedai, I think, turn back to the Mishnah on Daf Pei Zayin Amud Beis. And we'll read a few lines in the Mishnah just to refresh our memory. So if you're counting down from the beginning of the Mishnah itself on Pei Zayin Amud Beis, you'll count down around 10 lines. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ksubasa al Nichse Baila Harishon. The Tanakama had disqualified her ksuba even as far as the first husband is concerned, even though that's a valid marriage. Comes along Rabbi Yossi and he disagrees, and he says that the ksuba with regard to the first marriage, the first husband, is still valid. Now, if we look at it from the perspective of his rights to collect many different dimensions, like Maisi Adel, for example, Mitziasa, so then we're not going to consider him. I mean, he went out to Bivina Sayyam, and for whatever reason, he didn't come back on time, and now somebody falsely testified that he had died. So Rabbi Yossi says there's no reason why he should be knocked out of the ksuba. Rabbi Lazar also disagrees with Tanakama, but only in a limited sense. No, it's the first husband doesn't deserve any knas, and therefore he should gain the benefits that he would normally gain in a marriage, in a ksuba. But notice that Rabbi Lazar does not say anything about the ksuba itself. That was the discussion of Yossi. Our sugi is going to try to analyze this. And finally, we have Rabbi Shimon as the third Tana in the Mishnah, and he disagrees with the Tanakama's statement, his ruling, that if they died, there's no Yibum. Omer, but Rav Shimon disagrees, and he holds that the brother of the first Baal is Miyabimosa, even Lechatchila. And Biyasa Chalitzasa, Meyachim Shal Rishon, Poteres Es Tzarasa, like any case of two tzaras that fell for Yibum, and the Chalitza of one of them, or the Yibum of one of them, patters up the other tzara. That's exactly what happens here. So as far as the Rishon, the first husband, is concerned, according to Reb Shimon, the laws of Yibum go into full force like they normally would. And now we're looking at the Gemara here on Daf Tzadi Aleph. And the Gemara says the following: Rabbi Yossi Omer Ksubas al Nichsei Baila Rishon, Rabbi Laz Omer Rishon Zakayv Mitzias, etc. Rabbi Shimon Omer Biyasa v'Chalitzas Miachim Shal Rishon B'Tesas. Omer Avhuna. So we're about to embark upon a sugya that records a machlokes between Avhuna and Rabbi Yochanan as to how to interpret these three Tanoim, specifically the relationship between one Tana and the other. Rav Huna's opinion is that Basroi Modu Likamoi, that the later Tanoim, let's say Rav Shimon, would be moded to the earlier Tanoim, Rav Yossi and Rav Lazar. But on the other hand, Kamoi Lo Modu Levasroi, the first Tana, let's call it, in this case, Rav Yossi, would not agree with Rav Shimon. And the Gemara is going to analyze it, so we don't have to go into detail just yet. Here's Rav Huna. Rabbi Shimon, that's Basroi, the last Tana on this list, who allows for Yibum from the Rishon, Module LeRabbi Eliezer, he certainly would agree that the first husband has rights to Mitzia and to Maisi Adel, to Hafaras Nedarim. And this logic, Rav Huna's logic, is a Kal V'chomer. Tema bia de ikari surah, if Rabbi Shimon allows for bia, meaning Yibum, which is the most prominent Isser as far as the Ishus is concerned. And yet, Rabbi Shimon insists that we recognize the Ishus as the Torah does between the first husband and her, and therefore all of the repercussions, all the implications are in effect. And Umat Biadikar Yisur Velokanis, and Rabbi Shimon did not impose a knas vis-a-vis the first marriage, is Kolshkein Mitziyasu Maisided Mamonahu. These are only monetary laws. That's not the Iker Nesuin. Certainly, Rabbi Shimon would say that there's no knas. Now we get to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Loza. Rabbi Loza, if you remember, was the second Tana in the list of three, and he gave the Baal the rights to all the monetary benefits that accrue to a husband in marriage, Mitziyasa, and Maisiyadeh, etc. Lo modile Rav Shimon. He's not going to go as far as Rav Shimon went to recognize the Ishus to the Rishon to such an extent that we could be Mater Yimu. Aval Bia di Surah Hu Dekonitz. So that from Rav Shimon, according to Rav Huna's logic, we get a Kal V'chomer. Because if there's no Knas on Isa, for sure there's not going to be a Knas on Mama. But Rabbi Loza is going to say, no, I'm only willing to alleviate the Rishon of a Knas in Mama, but not in Isurim. I'm not going to allow him to be B'yamim. Now we get to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi was the first Tana in the Mishnah. That's what we call Kamoi. And Rabbi Yossi was saying that Ksubasal Nichse Baila Harisha, that she could collect her ksuba from her first husband. Says Rav Huna of Rabbi Yossi lo modulu. He's not going to accept neither Rab Shimon nor Rabbi Lazar. He's going to hold that Mitziyasa, Umaisiyadeh, and Yibum are all subject to the Knas. But Ksuba, here, Rabbi Yossi says, we're not going to impose a Knas. Why not? The whole purpose of the Ksuba is to pay up obligations within the framework of Gerich when he divorces her. So basically, according to Rabbi Yossi's logic, we will classify Ksuba as Gerishin, or call it Ascholas HaGerishin, because it's all within the process of Gerishin. And we are encouraging him, and we're going to, indeed, if need be, force him to divorce his wife. That's part of this Knas. So then, within the context of the get, he'll collect his Ksuba. Avalhani, the Yasvi Tuse Kodesh. But the other rights are rights within marriage. They're not rights that are generated by Gerishin, but rather by the Ishus and the Nesuin themselves. Those rights, according to Rabbi Yossi, have to be wiped off the board because of the Knas. All this is Rav Huna. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rav Huna. Omar, he says just the opposite. Kamoi modula basroi. The first Tanoim agreed to the later Tanoim. Basroi lo modu lekamoi. The later Tanoim reject the first Tanoim. And now Rabbi Yochanan explains. Rabbi Yossi, who is the Kamoi, and he said that there is a ksuba with regard to the first Baal, module le Rabbi Lazar, he's going to be modul that in Dini Momenos, we give the first husband the rights, not only to ksuba, but also to Mitziyasa Maisideva first Nedorah. Because if ksuba to mididei l'dida lokanis, kolshkein Mitziyasa Maisideva to midida l'didei lokanis. In the case of ksuba, that's a payment that the Baal gives to the Isha, he pays up the Isha. And here she deserves a knas because she went ahead and married the second chap. And therefore, it makes sense that there be a knas imposed on the ksuba, on her rights to collect the ksuba. So Rabbi Yossi says that those rights of hers in the first Baal situation of marriage will continue to exist. We're not going to destroy and undermine those rights of ksuba. Okay, if you're giving her rights of ksuba and you're ignoring a knas, then how much more so does she have to give back from the ksuba the zchuyot that he has, namely Masechet and Mitzias, etc. Is kol shem Mitzias Masechet Midol, we certainly will apply this principle of low kunis. For Rabbi Elazar, lo module, he doesn't accept Rabbi Yossi, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan calls aval basroi lo module kamoy, because only Mitzias Masechet mididol low kunis. Those obligations that she owes to her husband, we're not going to impose a penalty on him. He didn't do anything wrong. Aval ksuba, right? That's where Rabbi Yossi says that the first husband has to pay up the ksuba. That's mididei from him to her. She's getting benefits. She's accepting the ksuba and receiving those funds. Honest. She had no right to go ahead and marry the second guy, and therefore she's subject to the penalty. V'travayu, and both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar, those who call the Kamoy, is according to Rabbi Yochanan module lebasroi module leRabbi Shimon. The Rabbi Shimon allows for bia in the case of the first husband. Mahani demichaim lo konsi bia deliachar misa lo kolshke. Meaning, if with regard to the ksuba and with regard to mitziasa and Masechet and hafars l'dareh, which is all michayim, and yet we're going to alleviate the knas, and we're going to say that she collects the ksuba. All this is during her lifetime, but yibum is after her death. So for sure, we're not going to remove yibum. What was the knas on the husband that somebody, his brother, should not make him shame Shmo b'Yisrael? He shouldn't be mekayim the mitzvah of yibum. Reb Shimon lo modulahu, but on the other hand, Basroi lo module lekamaya koit Reb Yochanan. Reb Shimon is not going to be moded to Reb Yossi, Reb Elazar, because biudu liachar misa lokans aval hani b'ksuba mitzias etc. Davi michayim konis. Now here there's a Tosas Divir Maskal Hani, and he has the following kasha. The Gemara says back on Peches that the reason why she needs to get from the second husband is because people might be choshesh that the first husband divorced her. So Tosas asks now, if you're going to allow the brother of the first husband to be miyabim her, and the people think that the first husband gave her a get, then that's a marriage of grushas achiv, which is a violation of Eishes Av, an erva with a chiv kares. That's the Gavaldig Akashi of Tos. The Mishnah says, Nisei Shalo Bershus. Okay, so we have to differentiate between Shalo Bershus Bezdin and Bershus Bezdin. And it's sort of counterintuitive here. If it's two Eidim that testify that her husband died and she got married based on those two Eidim, that's called Shalo Bershus Bezdin. If there's only one aid, that's called B'Shus Bezdin, because the Torah doesn't rely on the testimony of one aid. Bezdin has to accept the testimony of one aid as if they were two aids. And that's called B'Shus Bezdin. So in the case of Nisei Shelo B'Shus Bezdin, which means that there were two Eidim, then she's allowed to go back to her husband. And why is that so? Because in the case of two Eidim, we're not going to impose a knas on her. She had every right in the world to rely on two Eidim. I mean, you're not going to tell a woman whose husband is nowhere to be found that she can never get remarried for the rest of her life. That's a terrible egun. But if two Eidim testify that we know that your husband died, we're going to rely on two Eidim. And that's what she did. Does she deserve a knas when these two Eidim apparently perjured themselves? Amar Avhuna Marav, Hachi Hilchasa. Now, the words Hachi Hilchasa, that's how we paskin, imply that there's a machlokes here. And if there's a machlokes, then Rav should have been saying halacha is like, in this case, it's Reb Shimon. Amalei Rav Nachman Genuve Gan v'Genuve Lamali. Why do you say it in a language that indicates that this is only? I'm sorry. Why do you use a language that seems to indicate that this is a universal, unanimous decision? It's not an unanimous decision because the Chachamim disagree. So, Isvi Allah ki Reb Shimon, if you want to pass like Reb Shimon, then Ema, you should have said Allah ki Rabbi Shimon. The Shmai toch ki Rabbi Shimon calls. So you hold that the halacha is like Reb Shimon. But why do you say it Hachi Hilchasa, as if to say no one disagrees? B'chi Tema, and if you'll hold that I am inhibited from formulating it as halachic Rabbi Shimon, because the Amina halachic Rabbi Shimon, you might be mistaken, and mashma dafilu b'kamaisa. Right, Rabbi Shimon was the one who allowed yibum from the first husband, and therefore to say halachic Rabbi Shimon would be very misleading. Because Rav only meant halacha Rav Shimon in the case which was Niseis al Mishnei Eden. But he never meant that the halacha is Rav Shimon, that there will be yibum from the brother of the first husband. The Gemara rejects this because Ema, you should have said halacha Rav Shimon Achrona, and then we would have understood that only with regard to the Achrona, the issue of whether the two Eidim or not, there we pass like Reb Shimon, but we don't accept Reb Shimon b'kamaisa in the first halacha that there is yibum from the first husband. Kasha, the Gemara says, I don't have an answer. Rav Sheshes, Amina ki nayim v'shachiv Rav Amala Shmaitita. I really believe, says Rav Sheshes, that Rav was half asleep when he made that statement. Why? Because halacha, by making that statement, Michal de Pligi. And you're telling me that the Rabbanan would prohibit her going back to, to reinstitute the marriage. I'm looking for a word, I don't have it. And the Rabbanu would say, no, we're not going to allow her in this case to go back to her first husband. My havi leila memed minsa ansa. Well, where do you find any element of guilt here in the Isha? I mean, she relied on 280. The Torah itself says we rely on 280. Nobody nobody discouraged her from getting married. The chief rabbi of Israel married her off to the second husband after 2 Eidim testified that her first husband died. So how could Rav say halacha as if to say, well, the Rabbanan would disagree? So this is going to be the major subject of our study today, and it's called My Havi Leila Meva. Those 4 words. That's really the title of our study for today. In other words, what's the deal in situations where she had every right to get remarried to the second husband? Do we still impose a knas or do we not? Rav Sheshes holds, my havi lo lemeva. No knas. The Ode, and furthermore, I'm going to prove for you from the Brisa that even the Chachamim agreed to Reb Shimon that if she had 2 Eidim to rely on, she's allowed to go back to her first husband. Oh, resume. That was the word I was looking for. To resume her marriage with her first husband. And where do we see this? Tanya, I have a brisa. It says, Kol harayat shebetorah ain't tzrichas menu get. If a man marries an erva, there's no tfisas kedushin, she doesn't need a get. Chutz me'eches ish, and this says al pi bezdin. And whenever you see al pi bezdin, it means there's only one aid. And here the Rabbanan require a get from the second husband, even though she's an erva to him of Eishes Ish. So now, Rav Sheshes is going to be medayik from the language of the Brisa. Al pi bezdin hu de boy gita. Under what situations does she require a get from the second husband? That's only when it was al pi bezdin. Again, that's a catchphrase for eid echad. But al pi eidim lo boy gita. That's not al pi bezdin. Al pi bezdin means eid echad, implying that because she relied on the flimsy testimony of echad, therefore we're going to consent her, and with that class she can't get married unless she gets a get even from the chain. But if there were 2 eidim and we don't need a heter bezdin, then we're going to apply the logic of my havi lo lemeva, and there won't be any knas. Mani, who's the author of this price? Reb Shimon. If you'll argue this only Reb Shimon, the Rabbanan never accepted it, that's impossible. Because according to Reb Shimon, al pi bezdin mi boy get. Rabbi Shimon holds that if she received the license of bezdin based on testimony of one single aid, then she doesn't need a get from the second husband. V'asanya Rabbi Shimon Omer, and I'll prove to you from a brisa, asu bezdin bara asam kizdon ish be'isha al pi edim kishigigas ish be'ish. But then it says that ID low boy get. So in this brisa, bezdin were machshiv their hora, again if they relied on one aid, is don ish be'isha, as if she went ahead and had an adulterous relationship deliberately by relying on one aid and marrying a second husband, and therefore she's asura al baila rishon. We'll see later on whether she has to bring a carbon when her first husband comes back alive. But if she was married al pi shnei edim, then it's kishigas ish be'isha, and she could resume her marriage to her first husband. Now, this is against Reb Shimon. Why? Because according to Reb Shimon, Edi ve'edi lo boy get. Meaning, even if there was one aid, she doesn't need a get because there's no knas. And you see here in this brisa that Reb Shimon equates both these cases of bezdin bo rasam, which is eid echad, as opposed to shnei edim, and he makes an analogy, and both these cases are like znus of each, whether it's b'mezid in the case of one aid, if it's b'shogeg in the case of 2 eidim. But in both cases, whether it's mezid or shogeg, she doesn't need a get. And therefore, Elolav, we have no choice but to assume that the first brisa that we had before that said that all arayos do not need get except for niseis al pi bezdin beit echad, rabbanani. Because Rab Shimon is the one who holds that even if she was niseis al pi bezdin, meaning al pi beit echad, she doesn't need a get. So you see that the Rabbanan themselves are moda that if she was married off al pi shnei edim, there's no knas. And the Gemara now is going to spend a lot of time rejecting Rav Sheshes. The Olam, says the Gemara, the first brisa, Rabbi Shimon, the brisa that says that if there were two edim, she doesn't need to get, that's Rav Shimon. However, the Chachamim hold that even if she was married al pishnei edim, she needs to get from the second husband, and she's not allowed to go back to the first husband. Rav Sheshes was medayik from the second brisa that according to Rav Shimon, even if she was married off al pi bezdin beit echad, she doesn't need to get from the second husband. No. We're going to reject that interpretation of the brisa, that diuk in the brisa, and we're going to interpret that according to Rav Shimon, in the case where she was married off al pi bezdin beit echad, she needs a get. Utritz hachi. And how are you going to fit this into the language of the brisa? Rabbi Shimon Omer, asu bezdin bara asan kikavanas ish beisha ubai geta. That in the case where there was only one witness, then the Rabbanan are going to define and classify her marriage to the second husband as kavana ish be'isha, meaning as if he was marrying a pluya l'shem kiddush, and therefore there's a get that's necessary. But if she was niseis al pi shnei edim, so it's kishalok b'kavanas ish. That's not considered that we're going to make the second marriage into a marriage, and v'lo by get. In the case of two edim, you don't require a get. And that's according to Reb Shimon. So it goes like this. According to the Gemara's rejection, then, the Chachamim will require a get, even in the case, just 1 second. Just 1 second. According to this Gemara, then Rav Shimon agrees that in the case of us al pi bezdin beit echad, she needs a get. And the Rabbanan are going to say that even in the case of shnei edim, right, even in the case of shnei edim, she needs a get. So the Rabbanan are going to require a get both in niseis al pi shnei edim and niseis al pi eid echad, beheter bezdin, horas bezdin. And Rav Shimon is going to say that only in the case of eid echad where she had horas bezdin, is that case she needs a get, because asu bezdin b'horas and kachanis. But in the case of two edim, she doesn't need a get. Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Ashi again rejects the raya of Rav Sheshes from the brisa, and he holds Rav Shimon is modeh that if she was niseis al pi bezdin beit echad, she needs a get. And the Chachamim hold that even if she was married off based on the testimony of two edim that her husband had died, she needs a get, and she's not allowed to go back to her first husband. Rav Shimon in the brisa said, "Asu Chachamim bara asam." Kizadon each be'icha, and Rav Sheshes medayik from that language that according to Rav Shimon she doesn't need to get. No proof. It could be that Rav Shimon, when he was talking, he wasn't saying it about all the dinim that we had learned previously about nisis al pi bezdin al pi shnei edim, all that. No, l'inyan isura. He wanted to know if the relationship with the second husband generates an Israel Baila reach. Funny. That's where Reb Shimon was addressing his words. This is what Reb Shimon was saying. Asu Bezdin Bara Asam, when Bezdin accepted the testimony of one single aid, Kizadon Ish Isha. It's like an Ashes Ish, Shenival Ish Acher B'mezin, Umitzra al Baila, and she cannot resume her relationship with her husband. And that's a case of Asu Bezdin Bora Asam, when they relied on one aid. But in the case of Nisis Alpi Eidim, Kishigas Ish Isha, she doesn't become a Sur al Baila, because as far as her adulterous relationship, that was Bishogeg below Mitzra al Baila.